Welcome back. For the next item on our agenda, we're going to hear three different perspectives on the practical business of delivering lower carbon outcomes. First of all, we'll hear from Neil Wade, Head of Environmental Sciences at HS2, and he's going to talk about how HS2 is working with contractors and its supply chain to cut carbon and how it aims to accelerate innovation. That'll be followed by Jane Wakiwaka, Head of Sustainability at the Crown Estate, and she's going to talk about her organisation's route map to net zero and the challenge of working with historic buildings. Finally, Richard Baldwin, Director of Development at Derwent, London, is going to give us his perspective with a case study looking at regeneration and refurbishment. We'll have time for questions when we've heard from all three, but don't hold back to the end of the sessions to voice your questions. If there's something you want to know from one of our presenters, please do pop it into the chat box as soon as it occurs to you. So now I'll hand over to Neil for the first of the three presentations.
Good afternoon all. So I'm Neil Waite, the Head of Environmental Sciences at HS2. I'm going to talk about, firstly, briefly, a summary of where we are with the project and some of the challenges we face and the scale of HS2, and then focus on some case studies of how we're decarbonising contract and things we're doing on the ground now. So hopefully you all know what HS2 is. Phase 1 is the line from London to Birmingham, which is just started main works. Phase 2A, Birmingham to Crewe, which we've just received permission for, and then Crewe to Manchester is phase 2B, where we're hoping to place the planning application to Parliament later in the year. And then the eastern leg, second part of 2B, London to Leeds, is part of the integrated rail plan with the Northern Powerhouse Rail. So HS2 is a project. Its aim is to create more capacity on the railway, connectivity between cities, particularly the Midlands and the North, and also cutting carbon as part of the UK aim to be net zero in 2050. So HS2, once in operation, will be low form carbon transport, and similarly, as well as the journeys itself for private customers, it will also create capacity, modal shift, and move a lot of freight off the road onto the existing network as it takes passengers off the existing network onto HS2. So what's the challenge for us? Well, it's the challenge we all face, of course, trying to decarbonise not only the transport sector, but the construction sector. Those requirements apply to HS2 as much as any other project, and we have carbon reduction set into our various phase acts. It's part of our strategic objectives, forms the backbone of our environmental policy. We've set corporate KPIs for all our contractors to reduce carbon. For phase 1, we've set a challenging 50% reduction carbon target for all phase 1 contractors in design and construction. And then we've set a series of other requirements. For example, all of the cars, vans, lorries and construction plants have strict emission standards to comply with. So just to give a bit of context, there's a few figures on the screen there just to get the scale of HS2. This is phase 1 alone, so just the London to Birmingham section. And if we compare that to other major projects, you can see, whether it's tunnelling against Crossrail, out of concrete for Hinkley Point, there's certainly a lot more excavated material than Tideway. It shows the scale of HS2, but also the opportunity, of course, to try and lead in this area. We have an innovation strategy, and those are the 4 areas we focus on, environment and carbon reduction being one of the main elements. And in practice, how we implement that is effectively a partnership agreement. And one of the main messages I want to get across today is that our door is open for innovation. So anybody who's got good ideas, good projects can come to ourselves. We work not only as ourselves, HS2 Limited, but across the whole supply chain to come up with ideas, look at projects that are funded either internally or externally. You can see from the slide there, it's a lot of things that all make up the overall picture. We work with academia, SMEs, and a range of partners across government and trade bodies. So before I give some examples of on-site activities, the main thing we've learned is that the real opportunity to minimise carbon reduction is through design. That's where you have that steep line at the start in your sort of map of reducing carbon. So it really is important to focus that on design and then recircle again through design again before getting out onto site. That is the biggest opportunity to rinse out as much carbon as you can. There's a few examples there on the screen. about how we've looked at the size of some of the assets. Can we minimise their size? In the design of our stations, can we reduce the amount of steel? Can we design it so in operation it uses less energy for lighting and heating? Even things like at Curzon Street, the paving slabs are now going to be 12 mil smaller in depth, but you put that across the whole site. Again, it has a sort of reduction in carbon. And then can some of the materials be used from sustainable materials? So some of the vent shafts are going to be used from sustainably sourced wood. So then when we get into construction, we've prioritised a series of items, concrete being one of them. I know that's been spoken about over the last 2 days in this conference. So we had a series of trials ongoing across the project of new low carbon concretes as they get developed. So on the left hand of the slide there, you can see one we did in the Victoria Crossover Road Box, which is in London, part of our SES contract, Costain Skanska. So that particular solution by Cemix of 42% reduction in CO2. And we've also partnered with the Mineral Products Association. They've obtained funding from Bays to develop a range of low carbon concretes. So our role there is once they're available, we can test them on our site, see if they work, get the testing done and liaise with the standards bodies to get them certified. So our contractor Align in the central region of phase 1 is testing a whole range of their products. Diesel generators are very much the scourge of construction sites. So we've been looking at a range of ways that we can move away from reliance on diesel generators. On the left hand of the screen, this was a trial we did 18 months ago, and that unit is a solar hydrogen unit. So the whole roof is a solar panel, and it's backed up by a hydrogen engine. So when the solar again is not enough, the hydrogen engine kicks in. That was on a site for 6 months. The test was very successful, and now we've got a number of those cabins rolled out across the route. So direct replacement for needing a diesel generator next to the welfare units, especially useful on remote sites. And on the right hand of the slide is a clean air gas engine. So that's on our SES site in London, just the back of Euston Station. This is a project run by an SME called Oaktech. They received funding from Bays to develop it. It also has a solar roof, but it has a bio-LPG engine. In addition to that, it has heat recovery, so the heat from the engine warms the office block, and it also has a hybrid element. And we've partnered with a UK car manufacturer here, so in the future, the engine that will be fueling this on the bio-LPG is a converted petrol-diesel engine from a UK car manufacturer. So creating a new life, if you like, for that manufacturing plant once diesel and petrol cars are ruled out, of course. And the batteries that will go in it will be the batteries from electric cars. So once they're 2 or 3 years old, if they're down to 50, 60% power, they get taken out of private cars. And now this is a new sort of circular economy use in manufacturing. So not only is it a lot greener, of course, the engine runs on the battery a lot of the time. So there's co-benefits such as nighttime work. You can run off the battery and it's silent. It's also supporting UK manufacturers as well and making a link there. We've also been pioneering a whole series of alternative fuels. Again, this theme of moving away from diesel. When we started our early works in 2016-17, our sites were predominantly diesel, but we've slowly been introducing new technologies as soon as they're available. So on the left-hand slide, the top picture, albeit very small, is an electric wheelbarrow. You may have seen the BBC Two programme last year about all the heritage work and excavating burial grounds, those huge tents, St James's Garden, the back of Euston Station. So those electric wheelbarrows were used inside that tent to move the earth away that was being hand dug from the archaeologists. It then gets taken outside. So the bottom photograph, you can see a excavator. That is a hybrid excavator, although it's got a diesel engine to get it in place. The arm's electric. When it moves one way or the other, it charges itself. In the middle, that is a electric telehandler. Again, brought onto our site about 18 months, 2 years ago, the first one in the UK, and now much more common in use. And the bottom left photograph is a solar pod. So just generates electricity it can use for recharging equipment. I'm not going to play it now, but when you get the slides and you can see the YouTube link, the video on the right was done a couple of weeks ago when we had the Minister on site at Curzon Street in Birmingham, and it aligned with the launch of the Birmingham Clean Air Zone. And that showcases, it's only about 2 minutes long, that showcases some of the plant we have on site there as well, including the world's first 250-ton fully electric crawler crane that was on our site at that time. Another part of it, of course, is not just moving to new stuff, but making the existing plant cleaner. Battery and hydrogen is still in development, particularly for larger plants. So how can we clean those up and reduce carbon in the meantime? So on the left-hand part of the slide, we've done a study with Imperial College London to see how we can reduce emissions of carbon for existing plant. And it seemed apparent to us a couple of years ago that it's very common on projects to have transport management plans for how you manage your HGVs on the road, but there's no comparative plan for non-road mobile machinery, whether it's the simplest things like selecting the correct equipment, the right size equipment, reducing idling and efficiencies. But also in this study, we've done a lot of analysis. We've done mini PEMS testing of plant to see what they actually emit compared to what their EU stage class is. We've also hooked up staff to air quality monitors and gone through a series of different behaviours on site to see how we can optimise and minimise that. So we'll be publishing shortly our NRM management plan, which we hope to be taken up as an industry norm in the future to be most efficient with the plant we've got. On the right-hand side, that was our project to develop a retrofit. So this is commonplace in certain sectors, for example, buses in clean air zone and city centres. So the technology is there, but it's never been applied to construction plant before. So we worked with a company called Eminox, Imperial College London. The piling rig you can see on the picture there is a Balfour Beatty piling rig. Also with emissions analytics and the Energy Saving Trust. So we developed the solution, ran the test, got it certified, and then did the same thing again for larger plants. So we now have certified, which is available to anybody in the whole UK, a retrofit solution, one for any plant between 150 and 300 kilowatts, and then another one for 300 kilowatts above. And the test was so successful that it's certified for any engine type, any make or model. So any piece of equipment between those power bands could relatively cheaply get retrofitted. And the tests have proven that it's cleaner than EU stage 5. So it's cleaner than equipment coming out of the factory. A lot of this equipment, I think the piling rig there is 1.2, 1.4 million pounds. We don't allow equipment on our sites if it's older than 6 years. So by retrofitting, you can get the full whole life, which is usually 10 to 12 years for the investments you've already made, then use it on the whole product. So old stage 3A, 3B equipment is stage 5 equivalent and cleaner. Moving forward to the future projects that we've kicked off recently, we obviously have a lot of HGVs on HS2. It's a very large project with lots of sites. And one thing we're trying to progress is hydrogen in HGVs. You've seen the Department of Transport's Decarbonisation Transport Plan last week. There's a section of hydrogen on there. You may have also seen the likes of the Teesside Hydrogen Hub. So we're looking to do similar with a range of external partners at H2. The first part of this is working with our contractor, Balfour Beatty Vinci, that are building the north section of phase 1. And we're retrofitting 3 HGVs, you can see the photos there, with hydrogen tanks to make them effectively Euro 6 diesel / hydrogen hybrid. So it's almost getting used to using hydrogen and proving hydrogen can work in a construction environment. A stepping stone to it, if you like, the same way hybrid electric is in the private car market. The second part of that project is a wider sort of strategic business case for the use of full hydrogen in construction vehicles. And we're going to partner with a range of other government bodies and private companies to try and get that tipping point on balance. Lots of people are interested in hydrogen. The fuel companies are telling us once we get guaranteed demand, we'll install infrastructure. So it's a little chicken and egg at the moment. So we're going to try and sort of create that demand en masse. And again, we're hoping to work with a whole wide range of partners, and the door is open on that to try and get that momentum and use the Y shape of HS2 to sort of install hydrogen infrastructure across the UK. On the right-hand side of that slide includes another range of projects. We've recently tested a range of biofuels, quite a topical item at the moment. So we did, again, with Imperial College London, we tested the exhaust emissions from those to determine the air quality benefits and a range of those fuels. From a carbon saving point of view, we didn't test them, but we're recommending the ZEMO accreditation scheme for that, which certifies not only the fuel's carbon saving, but the sustainable supply of those. We've developed, or we're trialing with Balfour Beatty, a product called EcoNet, which is an efficiency management system, which greatly reduces demand by up to about 40% of the energy needed at source. So again, reduces the number of generators or the size of generators. And even if hooking up to the grid, if you need a less power grid, it's obviously a lot quicker and a lot cheaper to connect. We continue to look at renewable energy. We've got solar. The picture you can see in the middle on the right there is a solar wind pod that we're looking to place on our project. And only a couple of weeks ago, the picture at the bottom, the Victoria Road crossover box, which is just down the road from our Old Oak Common Station in London, with our contractor SCS, we've installed our first 2 hydrogen fuel cell generators, so a direct swap from diesel generators. So there's a lot of activity in this area. We're trying to have the role of, as soon as a technology is available, if we can play the role of getting it onto our site, prove it works, and then encourage it across our supply chain, we can really change how long it takes to get these solutions out in the market and usable. So to wrap up, going forward, I mean, the challenges for the project is we need to make sure we continue meeting all our requirements, our core requirements for obviously the impact communities, keep driving policy forward and adapting to regulation change and trying to lead as being a carbon reduction policy, and also working with a wide range of partners to get them maximise those solutions, get them onto our project, prove their work and roll them out. Okay, that's a very whistle-top tour. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering some questions in a moment.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jane Wakiwaka. I head up sustainability for the real estate portfolio at the Crown Estate, and I'm here today to talk to you about our net zero carbon commitment and the journey that we've made so far, but it's still very much early days for us. Just in terms of background, for those of you who don't know who the Crown Estate are, we are a very unique organisation. We're established by an Act of Parliament, and we are tasked with returning all of our profits to Treasury, which over the last 10 years amounted to about 3 billion. We've also got a very diverse portfolio. So in addition to our extensive real estate portfolio, which is inclusive of a large proportion of the West End and also a number of regional retail and leisure assets, we have an extensive rural portfolio. We manage the Windsor Great Parks and manage the offshore environment as well. So we play a significant role in supporting the UK's transition to net zero through enabling the offshore wind sector. I'm going to focus on our net zero commitment today in terms of what we've set out to do. And in summary, what we committed to as a business is to become a net zero business by 2030 and climate positive thereafter by aligning ourselves to a 1.5-degree Paris-proof climate scenario. What we have done is set this commitment against a broader ambition in terms of how we respond to the wider climate crisis. So our net zero commitment is essentially our ambition in supporting or playing our role into helping to shape a world around limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees through our net zero commitment. But we recognize that we have to be resilient, potentially against higher rates of climate change. So we want to make sure that we're resilient against that as a business as well. We also recognize that we need to be very cognizant of the biodiversity crisis that we're facing. We want to ensure that we're taking a holistic approach in how we look at our response to climate by considering the biodiversity as well. And that includes things like looking at nature-based solutions to enable carbon sequestration, how we really sort of look to protect and retain our biodiversity within not just our urban environments, but also our marine and rural environments as well. In terms of our net zero commitment, the first is looking at what we directly manage and control, which is very much focused on our real estate and how we decarbonize that. But then the second is very much, as I mentioned before, is recognizing our broader role and our potential to support UK PLC by really recognizing the potential of the seabed and looking at opportunities for not just offshore wind, but other sort of innovative technologies, whether that's floating wind or CCUS as well. When we set out this commitment, we were very cognizant that we didn't have all of the answers, and we don't by any means have all of the answers today, and we were really transparent about that. But we recognize that everybody else is in the same position, and in order for us to all get to net zero, we need to work together. So if we're having challenges across industry, we need to be transparent in some where those challenges are, share those lessons learned, and also look to collaborate so that we're really improving as an industry, not just as individual organizations. We also recognize that there's going to be a huge amount of disruption and change, particularly if you think about the role that technology and digital has to play, and that's something that we're very aware of, and looking to look at how we incorporate our digital sort of capabilities into how we approach decarbonization of our real estate. We have also, as part of being transparent, committed to reporting against our progress on an annual basis, and we've aligned ourselves to external commitments. So firstly, working with the Science Based Targets Initiative to set 1.5-degree verified science-based targets. And from a real estate point of view, we have committed to the World Green Building Council's net zero carbon buildings commitment, as well as the BBP climate change commitment, which helped to shape the scope of our net zero commitment as well. So within our public commitment, we've set out clearly what our scope roadmap and approach is, and I'll cover that very quickly here as well. In terms of what is in scope, specifically from a reporting point of view, we were very clear that we wanted to ensure that from a reporting, it's very much what we directly manage. So when it comes to real estate, this includes not just the operational emissions, but also the emissions associated with the design and construction, so i.e. embodied carbon. With regards to the operation, we're not just looking at energy, we're also looking at water and waste. And we wanted to ensure that we included customer procured emissions as well, with regards to building related energy, because we wanted to make sure that we're looking at buildings as a whole as opposed to just looking at what we own. We also wanted to account for our other directly managed activities, whether they're corporate, but also our winter activities as well. We're also aware that we're not just kind of starting from a zero sort of baseline. We're able to sort of work on great work that has happened in the past, both in terms of our involvement in industry, which includes things like being part of the BBP Design for Performance Pioneer Network, which has subsequently led to the launch of the Neighbour scheme. We're also really proud of some of the achievements that we've achieved, including things like the WELL Platinum on our headquarters, which is the first WELL Platinum in Europe, and also achieving the first BREEAM Outstanding in a listed building at 7 Eyre Street. But we also know that there's a huge amount of work that we have to do, and what we started to do was identify at very high level where those key focus areas are. And while I won't go into all of them, they include things like how we invest into our digital capabilities, how we look to kind of build that community of practice and capability within the business, who do we need to be collaborating with. So who are the statutory bodies that we need to be engaging closely with, like Historic England, but also the types of customers that we want as well. And how do we start to build our technical understanding? So we've been doing quite a lot of pilots, which I'll start to talk to, just to build that technical understanding of what it actually means to deliver net zero at a building level. These aren't by any means a complete sort of set of milestones that we've identified, and what we've committed to is we know that there's a lot of work that we need to do up front, but as our understanding and as our journey continues to evolve, we'll be looking to set additional milestones to help us shape us in order to get to net zero by 2030. In terms of our overall approach from a real estate point of view, we are very much adopting the energy hierarchy principle. So the focus is on what we can do to meaningfully reduce whole life carbon, both associated with the construction and operation of our activities. And what we're looking at doing at the moment, minimum standards or requirements in terms of what each of our projects and schemes will look to deliver against. After we've maximized those opportunities, it's about increasing renewable energy supply and generation. So we're looking at both what can we do to increase on-site generation, followed by what are the best routes of renewable energy procurement that we can look at, and very much aligning with industry best practice, like with the UK GBC. As a very last resort, we're looking to offset any carbon, but it is very much a last resort. And our ambition in the long term, post-30, is to have a plan to completely eliminate the use of carbon offset altogether. Just from a real estate point of view, we know that it's a very complicated landscape that we're working to, and I just wanted to pull out how much things are just rapidly changing, whether that's from a policy point of view. I've just given some from the London point of view, but we know that Bays, etc., are doing a huge amount in this space as well. We know that our customers are changing. So this is the British Retail Consortium's pathway, climate change pathway that they announced to get to net zero by 2040. The investor ambitions are changing as well. So things like CREM is taking more of a prevalence, and our industry understanding is changing as well. And you can just see a few of the documents that are kind of out there and constantly being updated. So our understanding and our thinking about what net zero actually means is something that's very much evolving, and trying to pin our strategy against that is something that is incredibly challenging. However, we know we have to start somewhere, and we have been piloting this on a number of schemes. An example of this, this is just a quick update in terms of some of the work that we've done today. And as I mentioned, it's not just around kind of building the technical knowledge, but it's around how do we engage with industry? How do we kind of build also that community of practice? And that's an area of focus that we're really looking at prioritizing at the moment. So how do we make sure that our supply chain, our colleagues are all have a clear understanding of what net zero means to them and their day jobs, and making sure that it's them delivering it, because it's not the role of the sustainability team to deliver. And just in terms of some examples of some projects where we've been thinking about this, for some of our developments, most of you may be aware that we own quite an extensive part of West End, which the majority of it is either listed or in conservation areas, and we're having to work in quite tight sort of parameters. So when we're looking at developments, we've got things like height restrictions, etc. So if we're trying to maximize spaces, we are quite limited, and that does kind of pose some challenges. But what we've been looking at is setting out initially what we think are some potential embodied carbon targets that we want all of our developments to deliver against. On the left is an example scheme which was in design prior to the launch of our net zero commitment and embodied carbon. But what we were able to do is kind of give these targets and really challenge our supply chain to really consider what are the opportunities to meaningfully reduce carbon. And I have to say we've been very fortunate. I think it's incredibly important to make sure that you ensure that you have the right team to be able to help deliver that, because we are reliant on our design teams and our contractors to be able to deliver against our ambition as well. And what the team have been doing, been working really hard, is to kind of understand where are those opportunities, not just to reduce embodied carbon, but generally whole life carbon. So thinking about things like the flexibility of the building. So can we make sure that the buildings are here, not the 60-year life cycle that's typically assumed, but longer? Can we make sure that how do we make sure that the cores are adaptable to adapt to the different range of uses? How do we look at the facades so that we're looking at potentially mixed mode ventilation, which we want to kind of achieve even in London, with some of which we hopefully the air quality issues will hopefully look to improve. So beginning to understand where some of those challenges are. I know the previous speaker spoke about concrete. So again, we're looking at some of the big areas, which includes concrete and steel. So what can we do to meaningfully reduce the amount of concrete and steel that we're using? And then how do we look to reduce the embodied carbon through looking at things like GGBS, etc. So, and what we're having to do as part of that is think about what are the actual practical implications of adopting some of these measures. Does this have an impact on cost, program, customer expectations going forward? So this has been a really interesting time for us to be able to understand not just what it means to achieve net zero, but what are the wider implications in doing so. We've also been looking at what does it mean in terms of the types of building services strategy, and how does that sort of relate to customer expectations as well. And we've modeled, again, this is very much kind of research based at the moment, what it would mean to get to a neighbour's 6-star rating. And we've looked at different sort of building servicing solution and what are the incremental improvements that could be made. In all instances of the 3 different types of systems that we looked at, we were able to get to the 6 stars rating, which we think is the equivalent of a net zero building. But the margins are incredibly tight. So we know that this isn't going to be an easy walk by any stretch of the imagination. And in addition to looking at sort of the new developments as well, we've been very much focusing on our standing assets, and we've been doing piloting net zero asset level plans just to understand what is it that we need to do. there are some specific challenges that we have to overcome for existing buildings. For example, while there's some really easy wins around building optimization, in the longer term, we know that we're going to have to radically look at things like changing our building services strategy. So what does that mean in terms of asset management, leasing? Can we do some of the work in situ? What is that? Can we do that without actually disrupting existing tenants in spaces? So there's a lot of, again, practical things that we're having to take into consideration. I think just specifically on the historic buildings front as well, because we have to also work with and respect the heritage considerations of the buildings. There are sometimes some limitations in terms of what we can meaningfully do to the building fabric. So a lot of the work that and interventions we've identified is very much on building services and operations. But as I mentioned, it is still very much a work in progress for us as a business. And hopefully by just sharing with you some of the work that we've done to date, it's given you a bit of insight in terms of where our thinking is at. But I'm very keen to keep sharing what we're learning and learning from others as well. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Richard Baldwin, Derwent, London. I'm the Director of Development there. I'm going to talk to you a bit about one of our most recent projects, which is currently still on the drawing board. It's at stage 4, and we are due to start construction of it in September of this year, starting with the demolition. This is our Baker Street project on Baker Street. It's hang on a minute, get it a bit bigger, sorry. It's a mixed-use scheme, a big office building fronting onto Baker Street, some residential down George Street, a lovely new retail courtyard with lots of public realm in the middle of it and towards the back, and then the refurbishment of some buildings that sit on Gloucester Place. You can see the areas there from the slide. We've got a fantastic design team led by Hopkins Architects, AKT2 as structural engineers, Arup as our services engineers, and Bureau 4 project managers, and Gardner and Theobald as our quantity surveyors. We're targeting BREEAM Outstanding, LEED Gold, EPC A is going to be well enabled. We're targeting neighbours mark 4.5. Interesting to hear Jane talk about number 6. I think number 6 is going to be very, very difficult to get to, but we're working hard to get to 4.5, and we hope as we go through the final detailed design work in collaboration with the contractors that we can try and move it to a 5. Sorry, that was talking about the home utility mark 4.5. Neighbours were at 4, and we're hoping to move it to 4.5/5. And then we're also going for wired score platinum. So there's a whole range of marks that we're trying to achieve on the building. And we're working very hard to get to those points to make it an absolute modern office for the future. Here's a bit more illustration of the project. As I say, you've got the office building there to the left, you've got the residential up to the right, the refurbished buildings down to the bottom, and then the retail courtyard in the middle. Some of the kind of key features of the building is going to be all electric heating and cooling. That's one of our key planks of our net zero carbon approach. And like the Crown, we've got a net zero carbon plan to 2030. It's a very open, declared plan. It's measured every year. It's audited by Deloitte to give us accreditation that we are actually hitting the targets. It's all based on science-based targets, which we feel is a very important measure to test yourself against. We're using air source heat pumps. Many of these features will be familiar to many of you. A really important feature for us at Derwent London is openable windows. I have a personal hope that in 10 years' time, and this building, by the way, is going to be designed to last for at least 100, that in 10 years' time we're going to have all electric vehicles in central London, and therefore the air quality in London is going to be absolutely fantastic, and that you will be able to open windows. And therefore we design all of our buildings with openable windows to hopefully mean that at some point in the future you're not going to have to use the cooling and ventilation systems as much as they're used at the moment. A big other feature of our buildings is energy monitoring. A lot of you would have heard about smart technology. We are putting in smart technology into all of our buildings to measure the consumption and how buildings are used, both in the landlord areas and with our tenants. And I think an important point about the tenants, a large amount of the energy that you use in a building once it's been built, the operational energy, which is just as important as the embodied energy that you use in terms of building it, is used by the tenants. They tend to occupy hopefully circa 80% of the space in the building. And we want to work really collaboratively with our tenants to give them the information to use the building in the best possible way to minimise the amount of energy they use. We certainly find that many of our tenants are very keen to do this and are very keen to work with us. So the smart building technology is a really important aspect of measuring how the building runs, how much energy you're using, and then providing information to people on how to better use the building to reduce the amount of energy that they use. Water recycling is another really important point. We mustn't forget about water. Water is a really precious commodity. I think all of us are probably reminded of that in the heat that's going on at the moment. So we're also very interested in the whole kind of sustainable travel issue. All of our buildings are designed so that people can cycle and walk and can actually use open space within the buildings, hence the importance of the courtyard on this building, hence the importance of the roof terraces. But the whole business of being able to cycle to work, I cycle into our office at Savile Row from the station, and it's great to be able to park your bike in a nice space, great shower and facilities that you can use to get fresh in the morning. And I think it's really important to provide that kind of amenity in these buildings to enable people to travel in a best sustainable way that they can. This is, for me, an interesting kind of slide in terms of the number of issues that one is kind of dealing with. It's kind of like a shifting focus from, it used to be many years ago, Part L, the building regulations, then came in the kind of the EPCs. I think EPCs are important. They're only one small part of the matrix of issues that you need to deal with on the sustainability agenda. Then came BREEAM, which is also yet another one important issue. And we move right kind of to the end, really, of neighbours. And that's on our Baker Street project. This is the first project of ours that we've actually set the neighbours targets, and we've set the consultant team working on achieving that neighbours target. And of course, then you've got the net zero carbon, which is the whole life carbon journey. And it's an important journey that we've all been on, all the way from Part L, all the way through to net zero carbon. But you mustn't forget about all of the other aspects that you have to address as you go through the design of the project. And I certainly would agree with the first speaker. The most important thing is to get your brief right at the beginning. We have a sustainability team within Derwent London who very much form part of the initial briefing to our design teams in what we're looking to achieve as part of our net zero carbon approach, what we're looking to achieve from an operational point of view once the building is built. And it's really important to brief the design team right from the word go. The importance of having great design teams that are involved in innovation, are involved in stretching the boundaries of what materials can do. It's really important to engage with those types of design teams to get the best out of them for our projects. This is just an image of what we think the building's going to look like inside. Typical kind of Derwent London space, great light, great volume. We're great believers in the quality of the internal space that we provide, and as I say, the issue is all about openable windows. And we've done a little graph comparison, which I won't go through there, but it kind of illustrates where we're at in terms of the operational energy and the importance of adopting the neighbours approach to it. Talking about embodied carbon, that's one of the aspects that we're particularly involved with in terms of the final detailed design of the project at the moment. And I've heard it spoken about by both speakers. You know, we are building it out of reinforced concrete, but we are looking at alternative uses of GGBS. That seems the main route that we're going down in order to reduce the amount of carbon. We are looking at raised floors, about going for a lower raised floor carbon approach. And we are engaging with the supply chain, particularly in the world of concrete. And we're looking at all different ways of reducing the carbon content of the concrete that we are using. And we're looking forward to working with we're going out to bid to two main contractors, and we're looking forward to working with those two main contractors and with their concrete subcontractors to look at off-site manufacturing, to look at minimising the amount of concrete that you have to put into the building, and then looking at minimising the amount of cement in the concrete, but cognizant of the impact on programme cost, because less cement equals more curing time, because you need more curing time to get the strength up. So we're very cognizant of making sure that we address the net zero carbon agenda, but we're also cognizant of time and also of cost. And that's one of the challenges that we will certainly be setting to the supply chain as we kind of move through this project. This is kind of like what we see as our kind of net zero carbon approach since 2013. We had a business model, the board committed to it, much like you've heard about the Crown. We've committed to net zero carbon by 2030. We did that back in 2020, and then we've published a very clear kind of pathway back in the summer of 2020, with the objectives of it being very transparent. It had integrity. It had influence through our supply chain. We were adopting an innovative approach to everything we did. And most importantly, that you were genuinely measured against it, that it was genuinely accountable. If you check out our website, check out the sustainability section of our website, you will see a lot more detail about our pathway to net zero carbon and how we are measuring ourselves on a yearly basis. So none of us have got all of the answers to how we're going to get there. These are significantly stretching targets that are getting put out there by all sorts of people, and we currently sit at about 600 kilograms per metre squared of CO2 on our Baker Street building, and what we're aiming to do through the detailed design is get it down to 500. But we're still going to have to do better in years to come, so there's more work to come. This is just an illustration of the courtyard. As I said, we feel a really important part of the amenity that you provide in buildings is to provide people with good quality open space. As I say, it's the building is using renewable energy from the grid. We're reducing embodied carbon and our reliance on offsetting. I agree with the Crown. We want to netting off at the end of the day is a last resort, and one really wants to avoid having to do that if you possibly can. But I think it's a reality of life just at the moment that we will end up doing a little bit of netting. I think it's really important that you design with the circular economy in mind. So we do design the building in a way that the materials can be reused and can be retrofitted where we can. And this is particularly important in the extent of fitting out work that we do. The last thing we want to do is seeing tenants coming in and doing their fitting out, taking out a load of work that we've put in, because that really is just an absolute waste of cost, time, and most importantly in the aspect of what we're talking about, carbon today. And as I've spoken about earlier, we really would like to influence all of our tenants, working collaboratively with them to drive down the amount of energy that they use on the building. So there you go. That's it from me. So thank you very much indeed. God, yeah, that's 47 seconds. God. So thanks very much indeed. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thanks very much to Neil, Jane, and Richard for three fascinating presentations there. Three different ways of looking at some of the same material there. Neil, perhaps if I could start with you. One of the things that I know HS2 has been doing is trying to look for technological solutions, looking at new ways of using things like artificial intelligence and things like that. How important is that going to be, or is it much more about trying to reduce concrete through known methods and things like that we saw in some of the other presentations? How do those sort of forces stack up for HS2?
Well, I spoke about the innovation process, and really is we do get all sorts of ideas, and I think one of the things we've learned from the innovation process to date is don't discount anything on first seeing it, because you're not quite sure where it will lead you to. I mean, we do know from a carbon reduction point of view, the big ticket items are concrete, steel, diesel, and those are going to, HS2 is not going to necessarily come up with the answers for that, but it's the role we can play in enabling those, helping partners, developing solutions to prove they work. As I said in my briefing, how we can reduce down that sort of prototype to prove it works and then make it the norm in construction and get those materials, get those pieces of equipment in the supply chain so then they can be used on other projects. So really it's a case of, and I know perhaps more on the ecology and natural environment point of view, we've had some more technological solutions presented to us, but for these sort of core things such as concrete, steel and diesel, it is really sort of hardware developments at the moment.
Yes, thanks, Neil. Jane, both you and Richard talked about some of these schemes like BREEAM and neighbours, to which you can, you look for certification of the quality of the design you're coming up with. For people who aren't perhaps as versed in these things as yourself, it can be very confusing that all these different certifications. Is the picture clearer when you get a bit clued up? Do they all make sense? I mean, Richard put them out in a nice line, or are they right for consolidation? What do you think?
It's a really good question, because we get asked quite a lot as to why we're going for certain certification. I think there's a bit of a danger of a bit of a proliferation of certification standards to the point that some of them could arguably become redundant. I think I do think that at the moment they kind of do slightly different things. The BREEAM is very much focused on sort of what is the design and construction, whereas neighbours kind of extends beyond the design and construction into operation. And I think with the BRE now as a scheme administrator for neighbours, I think it gives them an opportunity just to think about how that is positioned within their BREEAM schemes. But you are right, because I mean, there's other ones as well, like things like WELL, which we haven't mentioned, and then there's ones that are specifically biodiversity related. So I think it is about sort of identifying, not trying to go for every single accreditation, but going for the things that are really going to help drive performance for the asset, and sort of focus on that, and don't use it as a tick box exercise to get sort of credits or get a rating. Really look at how it's helping to shape and challenge how you're designing and constructing and operating your spaces.
Thanks, Jane. Richard, you talked about that in your presentation. Would you say that it's a sort of confusing array, or are they helpful to have a different variety of different ways to target what you're trying to do?
As Jane says, they all do slightly different things, but I think we're very interested in the neighbours one that takes into account both the embodied carbon, how you build, design and build the building, and then how it's operated. And we're very focused on looking at both ends of the telescope. The embodied energy that you use in building the building, and then the energy that is used in operating it. And then we're very focused on collaborating with our tenants who use the majority of the space in the building, and how they operate it. So certainly the neighbours one, I think it came from Australia in the first place, and we certainly feel that that's probably the best one at the moment. But a lot of the other accreditations are kind of market driven, whether it be BREEAM, EPC is a regulatory thing. The government are introducing, I think it's minimum EPC of B by 2020, or is it B by 2023? So I need to get that right. But and then there's another, I think it's B by 2030 or C by 2023. Jane have probably got the right answers for him on that. But it's the neighbours one is the one that is of real interest, and there are new ones coming in. The latest one, everyone's very concerned about air quality in buildings. There's a couple of new air ones around. Air rated is the latest one that we're taking a look at as well. So I'm afraid there's going to be some even more accreditations, but a lot of it is market driven, and tenants will be looking for a tick against each one of these measures.
Thanks, Richard. Well, some clarity there. I think you're right about neighbours being from Australia. Somebody must have had a right chuckle when they came up with that acronym, I guess.
Yes.
Neil, one of the things that I know HS2 has amongst its mission statements is to train up a generation of people in new skills. And often we think about that in terms of engineering skills and construction skills. But I guess decarbonisation skills, the ability to manage projects and with an eye to their carbon impact and things like that, that's an area where the industry must be short of people with the seasoned expertise that we need. Is that an important goal for you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, part of the legacy of HS2 is going to be what it leaves behind, not only the new skills and the new innovations that have been proven on site to be used on future ones, but also the skilled up workforce to move the economy towards net zero. And we have a graduate scheme, we have an apprentice scheme, and there's requirements across all the contracts, all our main works contractors, similarly to have apprentices, but they're not just engineering apprentices, they're across all topics as well. So there's a sort of network of trying to train up the new talent, get people interested in and certain areas of the community as well that may have thought railway or engineering wasn't for them in the future, but making that more attractive and seeing what a range of jobs there are available in the construction sector. And certainly, this year is particularly with COP26, climate change and things that are happening on the ground to decarbonise all sectors is, I think, very engaging for younger people and shows there are opportunities to get in there.
Yes, thanks, Neil. Certainly something that I see when I talk to younger members of my team is they're much more engaged with climate change than perhaps some of us older fossils. Jane, one of the things you talked about in your presentation was about being climate positive, and I think a lot of companies will say, "Well, it's difficult enough to imagine being net zero." How do you plan for that today? What are the steps that you are taking to make sure that you're in a position to go beyond net zero?
It's a great question. I mean, what we didn't want to do is kind of make a commitment to 2030 and just stop there. And the challenge was, well, what if we hit net zero, then what kind of happens after that? And that's kind of where the decision or the ambition to become climate positive was included. I think first and foremost, what we want to make sure that we're doing is looking at how we eliminate the use of carbon offset. So very much kind of what Richard said. I think we do recognise that initially at this stage, we do anticipate potentially the need to use some degree of carbon offsetting in order to get to net zero at 2030. But that is something that we do want to sort of eliminate. So what we're thinking about is where will technology, how will things change, customer expectations change in terms of how they operate their spaces fit out, where will innovation come in, and how do we draw that into our sort of business so that we're able to really achieve absolute net zero ultimately in both our construction and operations and not use any carbon offsets.
Thanks, Jane. There's a question from the audience here. Perhaps Richard, you might tackle this. You talked a little bit about concrete. And the question here from Dylan Stoppard from Genuit Group is saying, what efforts are there to understand where the embodied carbon data comes from? Are we checking our understanding of what that embodied carbon might be? I mean, I guess that's not just about concrete; it's about all the sorts of materials. What do you think about that question?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. We go to great lengths to actually investigate the claims being made. We spend quite a bit of time going to concrete plants, steel plants, any kind of factory making cladding, to see how things are made and put together. And then we get all of the accreditation, and so we dig deep in terms of the claims that are being made. We're very aware of, that claims can be made for materials, the way they're used, the way they're put together. So we will always dig very deep and looking for the accreditation, and then looking for authentication of that. And as I said, we use Deloitte to actually accredit all of our information on an annual basis in our year-end accounts. So yeah, we're very attentive to that kind of issue, because I'm fully aware there are lots of people making lots of claims about carbon-free this and carbon-free that kind of thing.
Thanks, Richard. Neil, I wondered whether you might have a view on that question as well, about what due diligence you're doing on that embodied carbon question.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly it's critical that your figures stack up and the like. So, for example, last year HS2 was certified to PAS 2080, so the carbon management standards, the first sort of large infrastructure project is certified to that standard. And there's a lot of third-party auditing for all the figures we produce and publish there. So, for example, later this year, we're publishing the first of our new annual environmental sustainability report, which will be a year-on-year report from this autumn onwards, and all the data in there is verified and certified. But I mean, looking at concrete as well, for example, I said in my presentation, we're working with the Midland Mineral Products Association, and they've been funded by BASE to investigate low carbon concrete. And one of the things they're doing there is going through, all the way through the supply chain, right back to the origins, the energy in the factories and the like, all the way. It's not just the ingredients of the product that's sold to the customer, it's how its origin, how it's transported, and the energy is used throughout that supply chain. And similarly, when I mentioned also earlier about the range of biodiesels available in the market, the sustainable source of that, for example, is critical, which is why we're recommending the ZEMO accreditation scheme. So those fuels are audited independently and every 3 months recertified to make sure there's a continued sustainable supply that takes into account all the transport and the origins, and they're coming from the correct places.
Thanks, Neil. I think we've got time for one more question. Jane, when Richard was talking, he was talking about building for 100 years, and I guess you might be dealing with some buildings which are already 100 years old. Is that sort of thinking about not just the use that there's immediately ahead of you, but how you cope with future use, future redevelopment of those assets? Is that something that you think a lot about?
Yeah, massively. I think especially over the last sort of year and a half of the pandemic, we realized that actually the way that people are using spaces or wanting to use spaces is changing. And again, that's going to continue to change. And I mentioned technology, that's going to, the way that people will work, the way that people will spend sort of leisure time, etc., shop, all of that is going to change. And we need to make sure that our buildings are resilient to that. So one of the examples that I gave, we challenge the team to think about how do you design that building so that it could be potentially not just used for offices, but could it be adapted for residential uses, life science uses, and that's had a real significant impact in terms of where they've sort of situated things like cores, but at the same time trying to reduce embodied carbon. It's a real opportunity and challenge to think about the future use of the spaces without trying to over-engineer buildings to begin with. But it is something that we're absolutely looking at.
Thanks, Jane. It's one of the conundrums that the construction industry has to grapple with, that perhaps the future might be less about construction and more about reconstruction and adaptation and things like that. So it's going to change the business model of a lot of contractors, I guess. We're about out of time, I'm afraid. So all I can say is thank you very much, Neil, Jane, Richard, for sharing your expertise. It's been a fascinating session. Thank you very much.